Anne had been working for a railway company for a long time and often heard frightening stories from colleagues. On the railroad, everyone knew their shifts and carefully followed safety rules, but there were stories that almost no one talked about out loud. Anne heard about some of them on her first night at the station. Then she had just settled in, and her mentor Jack told her about the night train running between small towns. Jack claimed that there were strange disappearances of passengers on this route, but no one was able to figure out exactly what happened. At first, Anne did not believe these stories and thought that they were just stories for beginners. But when she had to work night shifts herself, she began to notice disturbing details. Silent trains, empty carriages, strange noises in the dark corridors of the train. Anne gradually got used to the night shifts, and the oddities began to seem like part of her daily routine. But one day everything changed. That night, she was assigned to escort the last night train to Brooksville to check the carriages for abandoned items. She got into the rear carriage and began the inspection, moving from seat to seat. The train was almost empty. There were only a few passengers, immersed in a half-asleep state. When Anne got to the middle of the lineup, it seemed to her that someone was laughing softly. She looked around, but didn't see anyone. The chuckle was repeated, coming from the next car. Maybe someone was just talking on the phone, but there was something unnatural about the sound. Quiet, unnerving, like a strangled breath. Anne stepped forward to check, but once inside the carriage, she realized that there was no one there. A thick silence enveloped the walls. The uneasy feeling grew stronger as the train entered the tunnel and the lights dimmed. Anne froze for a moment, looking around, but in the darkness it seemed to her that someone was standing at the far end of the car. She shone her flashlight there, but apart from dusty chairs and old luggage racks, she saw nothing. Trying to calm her rapid breathing, Anne decided not to panic. She continued her inspection, but footsteps suddenly began to sound behind her. "It's probably the passengers in the other carriage," she whispered to herself, speeding up her pace. After walking a couple more carriages, Anne noticed a strange thing. Many of the seats were neatly covered with old newspapers, as if someone didn't want to touch the fabrics. Each newspaper was stacked exactly in one place, as if someone lived here and wanted to keep everything in perfect order. Her hand reached for one of the sheets, and then Anne froze. The dates on all the newspapers were the same, October 23rd, 1976. Anne froze, staring at the yellowed pages with the date clearly marked, October 23rd, 1976. Everything in the carriage seemed to freeze, in absolute, oppressive silence. This date was more than 40 years old, and it was absolutely unclear how or why such newspapers could stay here. Trying not to give in to fear, she picked up one of the newspapers and tried to unfold it, but the paper instantly crumbled into dust, leaving only barely noticeable traces on her hands. Anne had barely moved away when the sudden creak of the door broke the silence. She turned around, expecting to see one of the passengers, but again, there was no one. When the light returned, Anne decided to complete the inspection faster than planned. She heard footsteps again, but this time, they came from somewhere above. There was something subtly heavy in these sounds, as if someone was moving on the roof of the train. Anne knew that such a thing was impossible. The train was moving at great speed, and anyone who dared to get out would inevitably fall onto the tracks. But the footsteps sounded more and more clearly, as if someone was approaching along the roof to the place where she was standing. On each new carriage she looked into, the lights above her head began to blink, and Anne felt her palms covered with cold sweat. The train came out of the tunnel, and for a moment everything was quiet. But in front of the last car where she had to look, Anne noticed a figure standing by the aisle. A man dressed in a faded railroad worker's uniform froze, staring straight at her. Anne stopped instinctively, her heart pounding in her chest and her throat dry. She was looking at the figure of a man dressed in an old, worn-out railway worker's uniform, with tarnished emblems and noticeable stains, as if from long years of work. But his gaze was piercing, cold, and it seemed that in the empty eyes there was something inevitable and gloomy, like a shadow at the station at night. Anne wanted to call out to him, but her voice wouldn't obey. She took a step back, but before she could say a single word, he spoke. His voice was low, but it seemed to reach her directly from the depths of the train, as if after many decades spent in the dark. "Do you know what awaits this train?" he said, and his face seemed to be distorted from some kind of pain. "Do you know where we're going?" Anne didn't answer. A chill swept over her, as if the whole carriage had frozen the moment he said those words. She tried to make sense of what was happening, not understanding who it could be and why he was asking such strange questions. He must be just one of the passengers who may have worked on the railroad in the past. But his eyes, she felt something like animal fear. Her feet seemed rooted to the floor. When Anne finally decided to look away, her attention was attracted by what the man was holding in his hands. It was an old-fashioned pocket flashlight, but instead of light, it emitted a low, alarming crackle. Anne had never seen such devices before, and hardly anywhere else. She couldn't understand why this detail caused her such a deep sense of anxiety. She plucked up the courage and whispered, in a slightly trembling voice, "Who are you? What do you need?" "It doesn't matter," the man replied, slowly coming closer. "You shouldn't be here. Leave while you still can." Anne took a step back, but the man in the railroad uniform was moving closer to her. His steps were slow but inescapable, like the night itself. Suddenly she remembered that the doors of the carriage were supposed to be automatically locked during movement. The thought flashed through her mind that if she tried to open the door now, it might work. But her body still wouldn't obey. Then she noticed another oddity. The lantern, which was held in the hands of a railway worker, began to slowly flash with a dark red light, flickering like an old lamp. This light was unnaturally dim, but still enough to illuminate his face and cause slight shadows on his old uniform. Anne felt her voice come back to her, but fear had shackled her so much that she could barely speak. "What does this mean? Why can't I leave?" Her voice was trembling. She felt that nothing depended on her. The man paused for a moment, as if pondering her question. He looked at Anne searchingly, his face as if with a shadow of sympathy. "Many years ago, I was like you," he said at last, slowly, as if the memories were tormenting him. "I thought this trip would be the same as always. But I was wrong." Anne looked at him in horror. It seemed to her that his words hid something darker, something so frightening that she would have been better off never hearing this story. She tried to catch his eye, but saw that he was looking away, as if immersed in his memories. "Me and a few other people. We worked on this train," he continued, without taking his eyes off some point in the distance. "We made a mistake once. An unforeseen malfunction in the braking system led to an accident, and most of the passengers died. We were found only a few days later, but it didn't matter anymore." Anne felt a chill run down her spine. She realized that she was standing in front of someone who had survived, or had not survived, a terrible disaster. She was surrounded by an atmosphere of tension and bitterness, as if the spirits of those who never returned home continued to stay here on this train. "This place, it became a trap," the man continued, his voice filled with a heavy, sad feeling. "We can't leave him. Everyone who gets here seems to become a part of this nightmare. And now you're here." Anne felt a surge of fear in her chest, and at the same time a strange determination. She couldn't let this man, this spirit, convince her that she was doomed to stay here forever. She took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. "But I can't be a part of this," she said, her voice sounding stronger than she expected. "I have to go back. I have a life. There are people waiting for me. Do you think it's that easy?" He let out a bitter laugh that sounded like an echo of fear and pain. "You don't understand that you are already one of us. This place absorbs souls like a sponge. Every time you're here, you lose a part of yourself." She took a step back, wanting to leave, but at that moment something in her mind rustled, and she looked at him again. He continued to speak, and in his eyes, one could see the gloom generated by many years of fear and regret. "If you don't leave now, you'll lose what's left of you," he added, his voice becoming even more strained. "Nothing will be the same." Anne was trapped between wanting to believe that she could still escape and the overwhelming feeling that this train and its mysterious passenger were part of something much bigger than she could have imagined. She turned around and looked at the exit, which seemed to have become even more inaccessible than before. How do I get out? What is it? She asked in horror. How do I get out of this place? There's only one way, the railroad man replied, and his voice became softer, almost pitying. You have to remember what keeps you here. Admit your fears and mistakes. Only then will you be able to free yourself. Her head was spinning. Memories of the past, of how she had lost the people she loved, and how she had never been able to forgive herself for mistakes, swept over her. It was a heavy burden that she carried, and now she realized that she had to face this fear face to face. Anne closed her eyes, and images popped up in her mind, bright and sharp, like a sharp flash of light. She saw her younger brother laughing while they were cycling together in the park. His face was glowing with happiness, and she felt love and joy overflowing in her heart. But then that picture changed, and she saw him at the funeral, surrounded by people who looked at her with sympathy, but with condemnation. It's your fault, his voice echoed in her head. You couldn't protect me. She remembered that fateful day when they were supposed to return home, but she stayed late with friends. It was only a few hours, but in those hours everything changed. She remembered her mother running into the room in tears when she came home, how her world suddenly began to crumble into pieces. The brother who had once been her mainstay would never return. Anne stood on the edge of the abyss, feeling her soul being torn apart. Memories of her brother squeezed her heart, and suddenly images appeared in her mind that she tried to forget. The day she and her friends returned home, she could not have known that this would be the last joy in her life. The picture has changed. She remembered how they laughed and ran around the park, how he, laughing, shouted for her to try to perform a trick on a bicycle. But that trick turned into a tragedy. How could she leave him alone so thoughtlessly? The smallest mistake, the moment of weakness when she chose entertainment instead of caring. Now she's been paying for it all her life. Images from the hospital surfaced in her memory. Snow-white walls, pale faces of doctors, and the unbearable sound of monitors recording his last moments. She remembered how her mother, with trembling hands, squeezed her palm, how Anne herself, not believing in what was happening, stood as if in a trance. The words that he would not survive, spoken with composure, still rang in her head. It's your fault, the voice said again, but now it wasn't just in her mind. Her gaze swept over the faces of those gathered, and she saw the condemnation in their eyes. Everyone looked at her as if she was the cause of their grief. Every look was like a knife. Every whisper in her direction was a verdict. You couldn't protect me, they whispered, and her heart squeezed in response. The moment she stood by his coffin, something changed. She suddenly felt invisible chains wrapping around her wrists and ankles as she was being pulled into the abyss of despair. She remembered all the times when she could have made a different choice when she wasn't around. Each slip became a new chain linking her to the past, to his spirit. She was horrified when she realized that these were not just memories. This was a trial that she had arranged for herself. All these years, no matter where she was, her fear and guilt would not leave her alone. Even when she was trying to start a new life, the shadows of the past were always there. You can never forget, the voices whispered to her, as if they came from the very heart of hell. You're doomed to this. Tears flowed down her cheeks, and she felt invisible hands clutching her throat. Everything went dark around her, and she found herself alone in a dark room where her worst fears were reflected on the walls. Images of tragedy, whispers of condemnation, all those she loved and lost, suddenly surrounded her. Their faces were distorted with pain and anger. You don't deserve to be happy, came a voice similar to her own, but so vicious that she could barely control it. And at that moment she realized, it's not just memories, it's her curse. She was connected to this place, just like the railroad man, and she knew she couldn't escape it forever. As soon as she got here, she became part of something more than just a trip. She was part of this dark legacy, this dark history. You're staying here, a hoarse voice said. Forever. Anne felt hopelessness engulf her, fear engulfing her. She knew she couldn't just leave. It is terrible and hopeless, but she has become a prisoner of her past. With each step back in her memories, her own shadow, which had become a symbol of her guilt and fear, was getting closer and closer, filling the entire space around her.